Evolution is false. Evolution is absurd. How did we get into this situation where so many people believe such an absurd theory? That's one of the things that we're going to talk about today. I'm here with biophysicist Dr. Cornelius Hunter, and we're going to talk about several things related to evolution, but one of those being, how did we get here? Why do so many people believe this theory that contradicts so much of our scientific observations of the world? Welcome, Dr. Hunter.
Thank you, Rebekah. Glad to be here. And I wanted to talk about some emerging papers that are coming out right now. They're in the publication phase, and they're going to be interesting to talk about in the coming weeks and months. And then I wanted to talk about the problem of evil and show you guys how that works. And I think of it as kind of the canonical argument for evolution. It's by no means the only argument for evolution. There are many other arguments, but it is a very powerful one, and maybe the first one. And it once you understand the problem of evil, you really understand how evolution works.
And that's so interesting. You're the one who opened my eyes to this, because so many people think that evolution is really about science.
Yeah.
And what you've opened my eyes to is that there's so much that's wrapped up with theology, and there's so many religious underpinnings to evolution. And so thank you. I'm glad that we're going to talk about that today.
You really need to take everything you know or think you know about origins and just get rid of it, because it's all wrong. We are living in a mythology where there's all kinds of false stories and deceptions that people are operating under, both on all sides of the debate. So it's really important just to look at the literature, look at the arguments, look at the evidence. What our evolution is saying, what our creation is saying. And when you say, well, evolution is actually a theological argument or a theological theory, automatically people jump to the wrong conclusion. And so that's why I really take a 3-credit semester class to go through this very slowly and methodically. But typically a creationist, if you tell them, well, evolution is a religious theory, they'll think, oh, right, atheism, secular humanism, materialism, those are religions. And evolutionists, for their part, will probably think you're talking about something like that also. And the creationists will say, yeah, right. The evolutionists will say, no, of course not. But neither of them have the understanding of what's going on. It's not atheism. It's not materialism. It's theism. It's religion. And so we'll see a canonical version of that. And once you understand the problem of evil, you're really in a good position to start to reconnoiter the space better on how things work. So we'll see that in a second. But let me first show you a couple of papers. And bring that up. And if I can find the advance button, it was obvious before, and that's not it. Where's the button? There it is right there. Okay. I just have to relearn that. So here is an interesting paper that is just coming out of Joanna Massel's lab at the University of Arizona. And what she's trying to do is actually an age-old problem, and that is make the evidence, the biological evidence, fit common descent. So one of the things you learned in high school biology was the biological evidence fits common descent, like really well, like perfectly. And that's a false characterization of the evidence. It doesn't. The biological evidence does not fit common descent. It's the exact opposite. There's all kinds of variations from or violations of the common descent model. It doesn't fit common descent when you look at the data. So what evolutionists do is they try and fix the data to fit the model, the common descent model. So here she's saying, well, the multiple sequence alignment is a key step in phylogenetic analysis. So there's some technical jargon there. What is MSA, multiple sequence alignment? All that is comparing the genes or the genetic data between different species. So let's say you're trying to build an evolutionary tree for 20 species or 30 species or 50 species. you're going to take the evidence or the observations. What characterizes these species? Some of it is morphological. It's something you can see with your eyes. A lot of it is genetic, the genetic sequences, the genes. And that's a favorite tool these days since we have so much genetic data. So you take the genes that you think are homologous between different species. Let's say a globin gene that makes the hemoglobin. And you think, okay, this globin gene comes from a common ancestor. So these two different species, that their globin gene is related via evolution, via common descent. How different are they? If they're very different, then they've been evolving independently for a long time. If they're kind of similar, then there must be more closely related. That's the whole idea behind building evolutionary trees. When you're building an evolutionary tree or analyzing evolutionary trees, you're doing what? Phylogenetics. So that's the term of art, phylogenetics. So that's what this first sentence is saying. Comparing the genes across different species is a key step in evolutionary tree building or phylogenetic analysis. So that's all that is. And it's prone to error. Well, yes, because there are all kinds of considerations, but the major consideration is that the evidence does not fall into a common descent pattern. When you look at the genes or any other biological evidence, it doesn't fit into a common descent pattern. So you can have problems right off the bat. Unfortunately, algorithms that remove likely alignment errors from MSAs sometimes remove information residues. What that's saying is there's all kinds of attempts have been made to fix this, so cleanse the data of the quote unquote errors and make it fit the common descent pattern. Unfortunately, the experience that we've had with that is it also removes good information as well. So that's the statement of the problem. Making phylogenetic tree inference worse. So all those, what's happening, we haven't been able to improve our results. Here we present a novel approach. So we're going to fix this problem. And so let's have a look. What the first problem with all of this is what philosophers call theory laden. So you're allowing the theory to drive your interpretation of the evidence. Theory ladenness means the evidence itself. It's not merely that you have a theory that you are going to apply or pour the evidence into your theory. It's actually that your initial modeling, your observations of the evidence is affected by your theory. The theory is informing the very measurements that you're making. And that's what we're getting into. We're getting closer to that here, where they're taking the observations and immediately starting to filter them. Oh, this one isn't working so well, let's get rid of it. This one works better, let's amplify that one. And so the theory is informing the interpretation of the evidence. That's theory ladenness. And when you have that, it's no surprise that in the end you get evidence that supports your theory, because you have molded it and manipulated it to support your theory. So claims that, all the evidence fits evolutionary theory is false. That's after you have manipulated it in order to do that. So here, later in the paper it says, or in the abstract it says, we assess methods based on their ability to bring the gene trees of single genes closer to the accepted species tree. Okay, so what does that mean? The species tree is the evolutionary tree. That's the tree that they are trying to refine, trying to understand better. And then you've got the evidence from specific genes. And a lot of these specific genes are not behaving very well. And this is the problem I just outlined. So you got to manipulate these genes, this genetic data, maybe throw some out, maybe only take half of it, or whatever. And then what they're saying here is that, well, what we're trying to do is we're assessing these different methods, and trying to design a method that in order to bring the gene trees from single genes closer to the accepted species tree. It's just, that is a black and white statement of theory ladenness. It's not objective science. Now, there's nothing necessarily wrong with not doing objective science. You can do that if you want, but and some people would argue it is science. That's the way science works. It works in paradigms. Thomas Kuhn famously argued that, okay, fine, if that's what you want to do, but don't say that you're then proving evolution or providing evidence for evolution. The evidence is against evolution. Okay, so they're filtering the data to fit the theory, and then all the data fit the theory. No big surprise.
I see that, because you're saying, like, okay, so when the genes don't match up, they're trying to make it match up, and the way they're testing whether or not it matches up is whether it matches up with the evolutionary story.
Exactly.
If it doesn't match up with the story, then they don't consider it a good method.
Exactly. And when you look at the raw data itself and compare it to common descent, it doesn't fit the model. It's all over the map. Yeah. So scientific observations do not support common descent. We will force it to do so, is basically a summary of this paper. Now, this is by far not the first sort of paper like this. I mean, this is what evolutionists have been doing all along. Here's a paper from several years ago. Incongruence between phylogenies, that's when you build these evolutionary trees from different genes or different evidences and they don't fit. These evolutionary trees or phylogenies are incongruent. They don't match up. Incongruence between phylogenies derived from morphological versus molecular analyses. So again, I said you could see some evidence that some observations are something you can see, the bones and the muscles and the organs. So those are the morphological data, and then there's the molecular data. So what they're saying is that there is an incongruence between the evolutionary trees based on derived from these different data sources.
Now, a lot of times when I say this, that the trees are contradictory, between the morphology, the genetics, the protein types and everything, I get a lot of resistance on that. So is this something that is not admitted by a certain segment? I mean, you've got a quote right here from, the scientific literature, but is this something that is hard to get an admission about, or is this something known and people are just fighting?
It is hard. It is very difficult to get an admission on this, even though, as you point out, it is there in black and white in the literature. There's a sort of confirmation testing going on where evolutionists, there's those papers out there that talk about some side issues. This is considered to be a sidebar. On the whole, 99% of the evidence falls squarely in common descent, no question about it. And it is a mythology. It is a deception. It is a mythology, and it is confirmation testing. If it fits evolutionary theory, it's normative. If it doesn't fit evolutionary theory, it's grounds for further research. We'll figure that out. It's future research, and it's secondary. It's tangential, and it's a mindset that's the mindset you're fighting. And so it's a matter of what I've done in my work. It's to show how pervasive it is. There are studies and data that just show large amounts of biological data do not fit common descent. This is not a one-off. It's not, there's that one gene we got to fix. No, it is pervasive. And so you just have to point to that data, and it doesn't get the advertising. It doesn't make its way into the textbooks, but it's there. So we'll get to that. I do have several false predictions that show those sorts of failures. Here is another. So they're saying it's pervasive. There, you can see that this problem is pervasive. So that's good. They're admitting the truth there. Here's another paper that looked at yeast. They looked at 23 species of yeast, and they looked at more than 1,000 different genes. Okay, 1,000 different genes that are present in all those 23 species, and they think that those genes are all homologous. That is, they think that they derived from a common ancestor, an earlier, a species, a eukaryotic species, leading to these 23 species of yeast. So, okay, you got 23 different species. You got 1,000 genes. we're going to look at these 1,000 genes and see how they compare. And we're hoping that, most of them will provide a very similar evolutionary tree. Well, there's going to be differences, of course, but we're hoping to get some pretty good, consistency between these 1,000 different genes. Well, they didn't. They were all over the map.
What is concatenation?
So what concatenation means is, let's take all 1,000 genes and put them together in one big, huge sequence and build an evolutionary tree based on all of them together. So you've got 1,070 genes. Each one you can derive a evolutionary tree from, and then you put them all together in one big, huge data set and derive the evolutionary tree based on all of them together at the same time. So you have a 1,071 evolutionary trees that you've derived from the data. They're all different. There's not a single one that was the same. Evolution batted 0 for 1,070 in this study, and it was quite hilarious, actually.
Okay, wait. So then, what should we conclude from this data?
We are trying to figure out the phylogenetic relationships of 1.8 million species, because that's back then was the important number. There's a lot more now, but so we're trying to solve this big problem of what is the grand evolutionary tree of all the species, and we can't even sort out 23 yeast species. This is not working out very well. Another evolutionist said, it's a bit shocking. Yeah, it was shocking. Now, this is back to this paper. Selecting genes with strong phylogenetic signals and demonstrating the absence of significant incongruence are essential for accurately reconstructing ancient divergences. This is a statement, again, from a different paper back from 2013, of much the same of this paper that I showed coming out right now, of pre-filtering the data and post-filtering. So there's pre-filtering and there's post-filtering together, all kinds of filtering going on. The pre-filtering is, if there's any sort of evident problem, you get rid of it. Then when you run your phylogeny and you realize that it's not working and you're not getting the result that you want, you start to remove the data you think is causing that, and you try and improve the result. So you're filtering all over the place in order to converge on a kind of answer that you want. This sentence, this quote right here from this paper, this Nature paper, is talking about the post-filtering stage. If you're what they're saying is selecting genes with what? Strong phylogenetic signal. What do they mean, signal? That's a euphemism. What that means is it fits the answer that we want. Selecting genes with strong phylogenetic signal is crucial. And and also with the absence of significant incongruence. In other words, it's fitting the result that we want. So
strong phylogenetic signal is what this means is like they're looking for genes that are shared among different species, right? Would that be a strong phylogenetic signal if it's like wide? No.
The shared between different, you're right. Sharing them between different species is necessary. That's a necessary but not sufficient step. So yeah, you got to have them shared. If they're not shared, then you got a big problem. And by the way, that's another problem, is you have a lot of these structures that are not shared at all. It's like, it's not. So that's one of the pre-filtering steps that goes on, is we can only use genes or whatever structures that we're using. We can only use those structures that are shared between different species. And so right there, you're pre-filtering out a whole bunch of, there's all kinds of genes that are novel or unique to a lineage or even to a species. Well, we're not going to use those. Oh, okay. So you've now limited yourself to a smaller subset of evidence. All kinds of evidence that demolishes common descent is now gone. It's not used in your analysis. It's a very powerful pre-filtering step. So you're right, that's necessary. But just because they're shared, now you're going to look at the actual, how similar are they? And okay, these are shared, but the similarity patterns don't match the common descent model. It's not working, even for those that are shared. So even though we've done this pre-filtering, it's not working. And so that is that. So common descent is one message, one take-home message you should get here is common descent is very important. Common descent is obviously a very important model for evolution. They are doing everything they can do to preserve it. There are a few brave evolutionists who have come out. There's a few, papers over the last decades that have questioned common descent and have said, well, maybe we shouldn't have common descent. That would be a huge step and complicating factor. It would demolish the theory, really. But it is allowed. You can contemplate that because you're still in a naturalistic world. You're just thinking that it's a lot more complicated now because we don't have common descent. So they haven't gone to that step generally. Most evolutionists would still say, oh, yes, of course, common descent is very well supported for all life, for all living cells, for all cellular life. It's well supported, which it isn't, as we discussed. But that's the party line, and that's what textbook orthodoxy. And it's critical to maintain that because it would be such a monumental failure and forfeiture for the theory to actually, what we've been talking about for the last 100 years, 150 years, that's all gone. Forget about that we ever said that. That's not going to work very well. So it's very important. Common descent, if you forfeit common descent, you take away that was one of the smoking guns for Darwin, or the smoking gun for Darwin was you solve these problems. There were problems back in his time, and common descent was an interesting possible solution for those. It was a reasonable argument that he made. Turns out it didn't work. Turns out it's a failed model. It was an interesting argument. And so you don't want to drop that. It's very important. You really don't want to drop that. Well, actually, they have dropped it. It's just not for cellular life, for viruses. The species do not fit the common descent model for cellular life, but they haven't dropped it. But what about viruses? Well, for viruses, which are also crucial for evolutionary theory, there was no question they had to drop it. It was so flagrant. They violate common descent so flagrantly that they couldn't even go there. So with viruses, you've already pretty much given up the game. You're now in there is no plausible explanation, even at a cartoon level, for how viruses generally, how they could have arisen from a common ancestor, put it that way. How could viruses have arisen in a phylogeny, in an evolutionary tree? That has failed. And it's not even really an argument. It's not an argument at this point. Evolutionists have resigned themselves to the idea that, we have a lot of different common ancestors here. That is a monumental failure. And it's crucial because viruses are part of the story. They are a crucial element to explaining how life evolved. So here is a popular article, well-written article in The Scientist from last month, kind of summarizing where are we with viruses? Where are we with virus evolution, I should say. And it pretty much admits in this article, we had to drop common descent. Up here it says in the headline, new evidence suggests viruses may have emerged more times than previously thought. Remember, this is from last month. So when they say more times, in other words, more common ancestors, not a single common ancestor. But not only that, but more times than we previously thought. Well, what did we previously think? To begin with, we thought it was one common ancestor back 50 years ago, or whenever. But then it became clear, we have to at least going to have the 4 different realms, different viral realms, 4 different common ancestors. Well, that's not enough. Then they went up to 6. Well, what this is saying is 6 is not enough. and it's going to be a lot more. That's the point here. It's ever increasing. It's going to be in the teens, I think, for sure, in the coming years. I think right now they're probably up to 8 or 9 or something like that. The story of viruses as infectious collection of genetic material inside a protein or lipid shell is far from straightforward. Yes, it is far from straightforward. There's no easy answer here. Viruses arose in not one, but at least 7 separate events, each one giving rise to a realm that share a common lineage. Yeah, and 7 is not working. I think that's pretty clear, but that they're just kind of gradually increasing. Scientists have put forward a bevy of theories to explain how each realm came into existence. So you have at least 7 different theories because you have 7 realms, but there's actually a lot more than that. So there's no one explanation. There is no cartoon level explanation of here's how viruses evolved. It's not working. When you have a lot of theories, it's because none of them work. However, new genome sequencing data is compelling virologists to rework virus family trees by splitting realms apart and rewriting the history of virus evolution, making more. We take the realms that we had, we're gonna have to have more. And the way that you get a successful evolutionary theory is to split and split and split until you get viruses that are very, very similar. And then you can contrive a story, a cartoon level story of, oh, we think this is how it worked. Now, even these cartoon level stories are calling upon huge unknowns of, oh, well, then, a protein evolved, and then like 10 proteins evolved, and then this happened. Well, how did that happen? So there's still a tremendous amount of problems. They don't have a step-by-step, mutation by mutation explanation of how this actually could have happened. But even at the cartoon level, these problems crop up. So that is that. And those are the, let me say one other, did you have a comment?
Well, I don't want to go on to the next topic until we brought up a few questions that have come in. So, yeah. But go ahead. I want you to
actually do have another paper to talk about, but let's bring out some questions. And while you're doing that, I'm going to turn off my heater here.
Okay, so now Mekrashad says evolutionists usually say phylogenetic conflicts poses no problem to evolution, as we know what mechanisms caused it, like gene flow and incomplete lineage sorting. I'd like to know what your response is.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, so that's what it's all about, is if you have a theory and there are conflicts or deviations from the theory, and yet you have an explanation for them that is plausible and reasonable, then fine, that becomes part of the theory. And so this is one of the reasons why evolutionists will say, well, no, there is no problem. Well, everything you're pointing out is explained by, incomplete lineage sorting, gene flow, horizontal gene transfer. The problem is it just doesn't work. There's just way too many problems and way too many special explanations. So it's a matter of parsimony. When your theory is a big collection of one-offs and special explanations, and explanations that are far beyond what we observe. So, for example, Carl Woese, a major evolutionary theorist in the 20th century at the University of Illinois, realized in the 1970s and 80s that common descent just isn't working across the branches of life. And he came up with the idea that evolution billions of years ago, especially in early stages of evolution, must have been dominated by horizontal gene transfer. So he invoked the mechanism of horizontal gene transfer. Now you say, well, there you go. It's just like your comment here is that we've got the explanation. It's horizontal gene transfer. It accounts for this. Well, his version of horizontal gene transfer was way beyond what we know of today. It would be horizontal gene transfer on steroids. And evolution was happening that way because he couldn't make it work with the traditional vertical the species evolve from generation to generation. Instead, they're evolving at the same time by sharing material. We don't ever observe that level of horizontal gene transfer. So evolutionists will stretch that way beyond plausibility when these explanatory mechanisms, and that's the problem. You just have to reckon with the real evidence, and not just merely allow implausible explanations to carry the day. You have to question that.
Okay. So now Dr. Thompson says, can Dr. Hunter explain why there are genes with strong phylogenetic signal at all? What is his explanation for the pattern seen in the subset of genes with that signal?
Well, so this is a question that gets at a huge unknown in our knowledge, right? How does biology work? We have a lot of knowledge of how biology works, but there's also a tremendous gaps in our knowledge. There's no one that can explain. Like, have you ever built a world? Have you ever built a frog? Have you ever built a bacteria? Like, no. We don't do any. We're not capable of these things. So to be able to explain, oh well, this is why this gene has this pattern. No, that's way beyond our current state of the art knowledge. People don't. Nobody understands, has that level of knowledge. So no, of course not. But I could conjecture all day long. I could sit here and speculate. That's not going to help anybody.
Thank you. And I just wanted to put up this other comment from Mehrashad. He said, evolutionists often claim viruses are just reminiscent of early cells, but when I study them, I got shocked by their complexity. They are marvelous nanomachines.
Yeah, that's a great point. It is shocking. That's a good word for it. It's when you see something, when you look through a telescope and you see Saturn, it's like, oh, there's that shock value. It's like, wow, what am I looking at? Same thing with biology. Yeah, you look at this, even viruses, what should be the simple case for evolution to explain is shocking.
That's amazing. I haven't really studied viruses, so I'm interested to hear that. Andrew says, Dr. Dan literally made a video in response to this. I hope you both watch it. And I think you did watch it. Did you watch it?
No, I have not seen that. But it's and so he did not provide me with any information that would be a plausible explanation for how viruses evolve. So
okay, because I think you had email communication with him about it.
Yeah.
And he was here and he said, did he mention that we've known viruses were polyphyletic like 50 years ago?
Yeah, the time over which we've known that does not help. It's not a good thing that we've known that there is a failure to the theory for 50 years. That bodes badly the fact that we still believe that they evolved. So it's not a good thing that we've known that there's a problem for a long time.
Okay, thank you. And so Andrew says, if he means orphan genes, those also have an evolutionary history as shown by several papers.
Yeah, so everything has an evolutionary history, according to evolutionists. So it doesn't matter what you find out, it has an evolutionary history. No matter how much it contradicts the theory will bend to whatever we find. Whatever we find, it evolved, because evolution is true. So these sorts of statements are not helping. You're not reckoning with the evidence. These are falsifications of predictions, blatant, major falsifications that are then absorbed into the theory with implausible explanations. It's not plausible that new genes are just simply evolving all the time like this. That's a major problem for evolutionary theory. I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm not saying that tomorrow there may come out a study that shows all that. That's very, who knows what future science is going to hold. I'm not talking about future science. I'm talking about now, today's science, which should be uncontroversial. I'm not saying anything that's controversial. We should all agree. We disagree on all kinds of things, right? Politics, religion, everything else. there should be one thing that we should be able to agree on: the state of current science. That's not a debate. That's uncontroversial.
Awesome. Thank you. And I just want to say we're going to move on to talking about now the religious aspect of this and how it has to do with the problem of evil and bad designs, which we already had some really good comments come in about this topic. So I'll bring those up later. So don't think your comment has been forgotten. I'm looking forward to showing
Before
those.
we even started.
Yes. So let's hit it. What's the connection between evolution and the problem of evil?
Yeah, let's hit it. But let me just give a little tickler on one other emerging paper, which actually is a segue into the problem of evil, which is a cancer paper. And I do believe that this is a real untold story right now between cancer and evolution. And no one is talking about this that I know of, except me. But I think this is going to be a big deal, but it's going to take years to flesh this out. And when I say connection between evolution and cancer, what I mean is a connection between the failed therapy, the cancer therapies, and failure of our war on cancer, and evolutionary theory. I think evolutionary theory is culpable for that. Evolutionists make no bones about it that we need to understand cancer as an evolutionary disease, and that it is caused by, guess what? Mutations, because mutations are key to evolutionary theory. So surprise, surprise, they're key to cancer. And I think we're going to find out that this is, I do think that's a failed theory, and it's a complicated history. But evolutionary theory plays, and evolutionary thinking plays a major role in that. So a paper is coming out this month to further that argument, and maybe that is a tickler for a future podcast. Well, maybe I can cover that in a future podcast here. But I think that paper is going to help. It's not by no means the only paper on that's revealing this, but I think it's going to be a great help to further explain what's really going on with cancer. So I think this is an important and untold story that will come out. So tickler for the future. Okay, so problem of evil. Is there a question or comment that you want to read right now that might help? I can address it as I go, maybe.
Well, what was interesting is that, so we had a lot of comments about the bad designs. So the human eye is not the best design. Half the world needs glasses.
Okay, good one. Okay.
Okay, good one. So these are the types of things that are coming in.
Okay, I got the point. Good. So we will talk about that. That's good. So there are many arguments for evolution, and they are powerful. They are logically valid. They are very compelling, and that they are the reason why evolution is declared to be a fact beyond all reasonable doubt. Some people just say it's true, whatever, one chance in millions and millions and millions, there's billions, one followed by billions of zeros, there's no question about it. That is the consensus position. It's not a theory that we're kind of working on, but kind of crazy, doesn't really work, but we're working on it. No, it is a fact. It's true. Now, why do they say that? Well, evolutionists are not bashful about this. They're not making these claims out of the blue. They're not unsupported. Evolutionists fully support their claims, as they should. So they're making public claims, and they're making the arguments. They're providing the evidences and the arguments for those claims, and it all works logically. In other words, the claim that evolution is true, or essentially true, logically is a necessary consequence of the premises. That means it's valid. It is logically valid. There's nothing wrong with these arguments from the validity question. I realized you could make arguments about this. This is my position, and I think I can defend it pretty well. I do think these evidences are compelling and powerful, but also just really ironclad from a validity question. The problem with this is the premises. So I said that the conclusion is a necessary consequence. The conclusion that evolution is true is a necessary consequence of the premises. What about the premises themselves? That gets to the question of soundness. Is the argument sound? Well, the premises are theological. The premises are religious. The premises are metaphysical. Use whatever word you want. They're not scientific. There's no scientific experiment you can conduct to test or prove these premises. They are metaphysical. They're not atheism. They're not about, there's no God. No, that doesn't show up in the literature at all. It is theism, doctrines of God, attributes of God that are claimed. And I realize most people hear this and go, what are you talking about? It's all through the literature is what I'm talking about, but you just have to read the literature. So I have studied this in great detail, and I've categorized these arguments in about 14 different types. Sometimes I say a dozen, but it's about 14 different categories of arguments. And by the way, I'm not making this up. So the way I got to this was I asked the question, why is evolution true? So tell me why evolution is true. Well, as I said, it's in the literature. Evolutionists make this claim all the time, and they provide the evidence all the time. It's all over the place. And so it's not that difficult to look at the literature. I am a collector of arguments. I'm a collector of evidences. I'm fascinated by that claim. Okay, I want to make that claim. I'd like to be an evolutionist. I have nothing against evolution. I'm not a creationist. I believe evolution. If evolution were true, it's not going to, demolish my worldview. It's like, if God wants to use evolution, fine. It's not a big deal to me. Like, I really don't. It's not that big of a deal. What's really fascinating to me is the abuse of science, and what's a problematic and concern to me is the abuse of science and the claims in the name of science that are not scientific. To me, that's where things get interesting. If evolution were to be true, okay, interesting. It would be very interesting if somehow natural laws and chance could create the world. Yeah, that would be very interesting. Not surprisingly, the evidence is all against that. It contradicts that, but it would be interesting. So I'm not a creationist, but I am able to. I'm also not an evolutionist. I'm okay with evolution being false. So that makes me a pariah. I'm a persona non grata in evolutionary circles. So I've looked at the literature. I've asked the question, why is evolution true? I want the most powerful evidence, the most powerful argument. I don't care about the ones that fail. I want the powerful, strong evidences and arguments, and the ones that evolutionists use. I don't want to get it from a creationist. I don't read creationist literature. I read evolution literature. And so I collected those. And it turns out, they're actually based on theological premises. That's how I got to that. It's just mining the literature. So probably the oldest one, and probably the most famous one, not actually the most powerful, but a powerful one, is the problem of evil. And that was the title of my first book, Evolution and the Problem of Evil. Now, when we're talking about the problem of evil, we're talking about natural evil. So don't get mixed up with sin and all that stuff. That's a different kind of problem, complicated. We're talking about cancer and earthquakes and tsunamis and things that kill people or harm people, degrade our life by natural means. I realize the distinction can be fuzzy. Sin can cause what look like natural problems, but they're not actually natural. There's a whole debate there. It's like how you divide those. But for the purposes here, and typically philosophers will assume there is such a category as natural evil, and there's a category of moral evil. We're talking about natural evil.
And let's just give some examples of that. Like, let's just say venomous snakes, like snakes that can bite people, kill people, hurricanes, tornadoes, different things that might be destructive. And
cancer. But I'll come back. Yeah, and you could say cancer is due to sinful things, but okay, the canonical example is what's called the 1755 problem. And the 1755 problem refers to the Great Lisbon earthquake of 1755, November, All Saints Day, November 30th or something like that. Or November 1st, was that what it was? It was a horrific earthquake out in the ocean, which caused a tidal wave. The earthquake hit first, and it was All Saints Day. So what? They were burning candles all over the place. So not only did the earthquake just demolish a large number of buildings, the shaking caused a lot of problems, it also toppled the candles and started all kinds of fires. So you had death and destruction by toppling of buildings, the demolishing of structures, and then fires. But that wasn't everything, because to escape all of this, a lot of people went down to the ocean, and the ocean had gone out, and they saw, sunken boats and all kinds of things that they'd never seen before. The water was way out. Must have been quite a sight. And guess what happens when things go out? They come back, and you had a tidal wave, and it came in big and really killed people. So destruction by shaking, fire, and drowning. And it's thought that maybe more than 100,000 people died, but a lot of people died. And it was a huge event in the course of European history, especially philosophy, and the thinking of the problem of evil. Kind of brought that home. Like, wow, yeah, this is a serious problem. Why did that happen? And so that's a canonical example. It's the 1755 problem.
What now? I know, like, some people watching this are like, "What is this guy talking about? How is evolution connected to some random natural disaster?" So, can you clue us in what's going on here?
So there were all kinds of theologians and philosophers and scientists who argued in the centuries leading up to Charles Darwin that the world must have arisen naturally. Why? And the problem of evil was one of those strong arguments. Because we have evil, disease, predation, snakes, as you mentioned, Rebekah, all these problems, the world must have arisen naturally. And so then Darwin picked up on that, and the table was set for Darwin. By the time you get to Darwin's day, that was pretty well accepted, not universally, but it was an emerging thought that yes, the world must have arisen naturally, because you got all this evil. God wouldn't have done that.
And I noticed that, sorry, when I read a book from 1860, and I was like, oh my gosh, wait, this is even before, this is how could Darwin, his idea hadn't become widespread yet. How is it so entrenched already, this idea of developing by natural processes? So yeah. I know what you're talking about. The idea was already established.
Right. It was very much in the discussion. In fact, there was another theory put forth 15 years before Darwin, 1844. And that was more of a science fiction-y book, Vestiges of Creation, but it was all about how the world must have evolved. And what it lacked was the kind of scientific patina that Darwin provided. But it was very much this story of evolution. So it caused a huge debate, and there was a quite cultural uptake of this idea before Darwin ever published his book. He had written some essays, but long before he published his book, that debate had actually taken place, and largely. But long before then, you had, in the centuries before then, you had this had been an ongoing debate. So it goes back to the Epicureans 2,000 years ago. And by the way, after I talk about this problem of evil, I'll talk about another problem, which is even more powerful, but I want to bring it up today because it has the same form. So it's a similar argument. Once you understand the problem of evil, this other one will fall right into place, and it actually is a more powerful argument today than problem of evil. So if you're thinking, well, probably I don't read about that in contemporary literature, you will read about this other one that I'll talk about.
So you're saying that we're still affected today, even though we don't recognize this, and nobody would say we believe in evolution because of the problem of evil, that people are just not even aware of the things that came together for people to believe in evolution.
Yes. Yeah. And that there are other arguments very similar, of similar form, that are used today. So make no bones about it. These theological arguments and evidences are used today in contemporary literature, in journal papers, not just popular papers. And then a lot of these arguments are used orally. They're in the lunchroom, and so they're more social. So these arguments, each one has its own story, and some you'll find in journal papers, others you'll find in different places. So there's no one, and they come from different sources, and there's different histories behind them.
Okay, so they experienced this natural disaster, other things that made them say, hey, maybe the world arose naturally, and that was a way of getting God off the hook, as you've said before. So
well, let me explain. So one nice thing about the problem of evil is, once you understand it, you will have I want people not only to appreciate that evolution is a religious theory, I want them to appreciate the power. This is one thing I say to my students. I hope you feel the weight of the argument. If I don't think creationists feel the weight of the theory. And if you don't feel the weight of the theory, you don't understand evolution. Because you should feel that, and you should understand, wow, like, I don't understand. I can't explain this. That's a great point. Like, I can't understand how evolution would not be true. It's got to be true. So you have to be able to feel that to understand why evolutionists are so over the top on this, and they're so certain it's true. And so let me very quickly step through the argument itself as presented by the Epicureans. There are different formulations, but they all kind of boil down to a similar form of argument. Goes back thousands of years. It's often attributed to Epicureanism 2,000 years ago, but it probably predates that also. But the basic idea is, if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, okay, those three key attributes, then there would be no evil. And again, natural evil, we're talking about natural evil. But natural evil exists. So therefore, what? God must not be one of those things, or God must be distanced, so he doesn't have the knowledge of the evil. It's something. You're wide open at that point for dreaming up explanations to solve it. But you have to acknowledge these steps. If God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, then there would be no evil. But evil exists, so therefore, okay, then you come up with but you're leading to evolution at that point. And I'll talk about different figures in history who have pursued that in recent decades before Darwin, to mandate a naturalistic explanation. But first, I want to explain this form of this argument. Because, two things. Remember what step number 3 said? But natural evil exists. Now, how do you know that natural evil exists? Because evil is a metaphysical property, right? It's a metaphysical thing. If you were a crow or a wolf in 1755 in Lisbon, if you were flying over Lisbon, would you think, oh, look at the evil? No, it's just another opportunity. It's a feeding opportunity. Evolution has no space. It has no resources for these sorts of categories. It's not, oh, that's evil. Well, this is not evil. It's just, you die and you evolve. So when you say evil exists, already you can see that this argument is kind of relying on metaphysical categories. But so that's just a teaser. Now I'm on to what's more important. And what's more important is step 2. What was step 2? I went over it kind of fast. I did that on purpose so you wouldn't question it. It sounds so obvious. It isn't. So let's go back to step number 1 and step number 2. Step number 1, if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, then what? There would be no natural evil. Oh, yeah, of course.
Step 2, natural evil exists.
Right. But step 3 is the evil, natural evil exists.
Okay.
Step 2 was, then there would be no evil. So step 1, if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, then step 2, there'd be no evil. Yeah, right, of course. But wait a minute. Why is that in a course? How do you know that? Well, it's obvious. If God is all good, all knowing, and all powerful, then he wouldn't allow it. He's good, so he doesn't want it. He's powerful, so it's not beyond the reach of his long arm. He's all knowing, so he knows about it. So there'd be no evil. That's like a proof. Well, is it? No, it isn't a proof. You cannot get from A to B. There is no logical, argument that you can make that if God has through those three attributes, there would be no evil. That does not follow. It is not a necessary consequence. So the problem of evil is based on a fallacy, a logical fallacy. It's not valid. What you have to ask yourself is that true? Let me give you the missing premise. The missing premise is beings who are all good, all powerful, and all knowing would not allow evil. That's the premise you have to have. That's 1A. Okay, that fits between 1 and 2. If God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, and beings who are all good and all powerful, all knowing do not allow evil, then 3, there'd be no evil. Or 2, there'd be no evil. So then the argument is valid. There's a hidden premise that's unspoken, and it is so compelling and so deceptive and so powerful because it just naturally, we think, yeah, of course there'd be no evil. So when I present this to audiences or my class, I'll point this out, like, well, how do I know this? How do I know step number 2? There would be no evil. The only way I can verify, there's only one way I can verify this, and that is to find a being who is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, and ask him, would you allow evil? Like, that's the only way I can figure this out. So I ask for a show of hands, raise your hand if you are all good, all knowing, and all powerful. And I'm, looking around, and, the joker in the class raises his hand, but, nobody serious raises their hand. How can I find out whether this step 2 is true? I have to, get some more information to verify this. Well, there is one source you can go to, and you can read about what God would do. And, well, actually, if you go to Isaiah 45:7, it says, God creates evil. Oh, really? Yeah. God creates evil. I form the light and create darkness. I make peace and what? Create evil.
Okay, I wanted to bring this up because this keeps coming up, and it's not the first time it's come up in the chat. Andrew says, not a creationist, but brings up the Bible. So I know this is interrupting the flow, but I want people to get an understanding of what you mean when you say you're not a creationist, but then you frequently bring up the Bible. So how does this work?
Yeah. So what these comments are unfortunately revealing is evolutionary thought. Because this is not unusual. It's not just Andrew. This is a typical, people, evolutionists will say this is not unusual. It is a unfortunate revealing of the paucity and the vacuousness of evolutionary thought, the ignorance. And I'm sorry, Andrew, I'm not picking on you because this is a typical, very common comment and rebuttal. You can't refer to the Bible if you're not a creationist. I mean, what? Like, hello? How did you get that? Like, have you ever, do you realize that most evolutionists are Christians? I mean, this is so ridiculous. I mean, there's all kinds of evolutionists who refer to the Bible, like, and yet I can't refer to the Bible. I mean, how do I even dignify this with a response? It is so silly. It is so ridiculous.
So what does it mean to you when the term creationist, what does that mean to you?
Well, there's several attributes, beliefs of creationists. The world has got to be young. Small scale, look at large scale evolution must be false. Small scale evolution must be true. God did not create this world. God must not have created, get the must in there. God must not have created this world. God must have created, God must have created a different world. Those are when I'm using the word creationist, I'm referring to kind of the colloquial understanding of what we typically hear in our media, the Kentucky, San Diego, Australian milieu of creationists. I mean, I'm not pouring any special meaning into it. That's what they believe. That they comment. There are variations on it, and I know creationists who would reject some of these things. So I'm not saying this is universal, but it certainly is the general trend in evolutionary theory. When the tsunamis hit, 20 years ago in Indonesia and India, there was an article in Christianity Today by Ken Ham, or maybe it was an interview of Ken Ham, who is a leading creationist, and he said, "Yeah, God didn't do this. This is a result of the fall. It's not a result." So the fall has this tremendous influence on the world. So when you read things like what I just read, Isaiah 45:7, and by the way, I'm not a theologian, I'm not like an expert on this, so I understand there are nuances and there are ways to understand this. But when I teach, to students or explain to audiences that the Bible says God creates evil, that you get pushback on that. Right, there will be pushback. Students will say, no, it doesn't say that. It says he allows. Well, actually, that's not a very good interpretation, even though I'm not a scholar on this, but I know that Isaiah 45:7 uses the verb bara. The verb stems from the bara verb, which goes back to Genesis 1. Bara is used for creating the world, right? God creates, bara. So no, it's not allow, it's create.
Okay, so can you just summarize why you wouldn't be a creationist? Is it because, you're not trying to push a view of God created this way and like God must create a world in such a way? Like you're not pushing that view, and is that to you what it boils down to be?
No, it doesn't. It's all of those factors. There's several reasons. It doesn't boil down to one thing. There's a whole bunch. And I'll state them. The idea that large scale evolution must be false. No, I don't see that. I don't agree with that. There's no reason why large scale evolution must be false. I think it is false. It's obviously false empirically. It's demolished by science, but I don't agree that it must be false. I also don't agree that small scale evolution must be true. I think that is actually also false from the science. Science demolishes that. So it's not. It's got it wrong on those two counts so far. And then the idea that God didn't create this world. No, I don't see that. I think that I don't. I agree that the fall has implications. Yes, it says it right there. Things are going to change. But when there's all kinds of verses throughout the Bible of God taking credit for things and designs of species that we might not like, things that are not working very well. God takes full credit for that. And for creationists, it's like, well, no, that the fall did that, but it says God did it. Well, yeah, but that's a post-fall context. God did it only in a indirect way. He's back on some Mount Olympus meditating. The fall did it. So I don't see that in my reading of scripture is like, no, it's not working. And you see, they are affected by the problem of evil as much as anybody else. So when I talk about this problem of evil, creation, it's like, yeah, God wouldn't do that. So this problem of evil is a general kind of Western Christian idea that is influential in all thinking. When I say all thinking, I mean creationism and evolution, all origins thinking. They want to rationalize things and make it okay that God would have allowed for this. And I don't see that. So that I just, my disagreements with creationism are pretty much across the board. So it doesn't boil down to one thing. I'm also not convinced that the world is young. I don't see why that has to be so. Yes, there are arguments for that. I get it. But that doesn't seem compelling to me. So yeah, I don't think when you take black or white stands, when you make truth claims as evolutionists and creationists do, that's a big evidential burden. You take on a big burden of proof. What I claim is that the science is clear on certain things. The science is clear that evolution fails. On just so many aspects of evolutionary theory have failed. It's contradicted by the science. That's obvious. And evolutionists claim that that the science proves evolution. So this is a discussion that we can have. We should all be able to have that in a dispassionate. We shouldn't be name calling and calling each other liar and all this stuff. It should be a straightforward discussion. Like, yeah, the science contradicts evolutionary theory. There's no question about that. Also, evolutionary theory incorporates theology. I mean, it's all through the literature. Like, I'm not making this up. So the literature is clear.
Okay, thank you. So I interrupted your flow with the problem of evil for that comment. So I'm sorry. We can get back.
It's good that we entertain some comments and questions.
Yeah.
So I'll revisit the last thought there. Step number one of the problem of evil: if God is all good, all powerful, and all knowing, then there would be no evil. That is not valid. And there's a hidden premise, which is that all good, all powerful, and all knowing beings would not allow for evil. That's the hidden premise. And it's non-biblical. It's not me making this up. I'm not saying it. The Bible says. Isaiah said it. Okay, so don't blame me. Okay, don't shoot the messenger. Isaiah said it. So many other authors in Scripture said it also. So it's a non-biblical religious argument that is very deceptive because it's so natural for us to think that, oh yeah, that follows. It's just it works right into our thinking. Like, yeah, of course, no question about it. And that's going to set the stage that once you get that, how powerful this deception is, and you'll start to understand the power of evolutionary thinking, because it doesn't seem. I've seen this over and over and over again with evolutionists who will claim, of course, we don't make religious arguments. No way. There's no theology here. And then in the very next sentence or the very next paragraph, go right into some powerful argument that is religious. So when they hear someone say, well, this is religious, I think what they're thinking is that it's atheism. That's what creationists think. If you tell a creationist, well, evolution is religious. Oh yeah, right. Atheism. That's like a religion. No, it's not a religion. Well, we can have that debate whether atheism is a religion or not, but that's inconsequential. It's irrelevant, because that's not what we're talking about. We're talking about theism. We're talking about religious ideas, religious claims, religious beliefs that have been held all the way back to the Epicureans, and I'm sure before them. So this argument goes back all the way through history. It's got this missing, this hidden, unspoken premise that it is a crucial religious belief that people tend to agree with. And it's non-biblical. So a lot of power there. Okay, so can he provide some examples? One example would be Nicholas Malebranche. He is a Roman Catholic. By the way, most of the evolutionary thought in modern times does not come from Roman Catholics. He's one of the exceptions. Most of it comes from Lutherans and Anglicans. But Malebranche wanted to solve the problem of evil. And his result, his solution was God a virtue for God is simplicity. In the creation acts, God wants to eliminate or reduce evil or bad things, natural evil, but he also values parsimony, which of course kind of sounds like a good scientific theory, right? So that goes back to Occam's razor. So Malebranche is kind of, this is in the 17th century when modern science was arising. And so Malebranche is making God out to be a good scientist, a good creator. He values parsimony. And if you have to have zero evil in the world would require a lot of one-offs. Over in California, you'd have to have this certain species, and then, over in Africa, you'd have to have this other species. And you have to have all these one-offs, and that violates God's virtue, God's desire for parsimony or simplicity. So God is executing a trade-off. He is trying to minimize evil, but he's also trying to maximize parsimony or minimize complexity. And he comes up with a happy medium, which of course is not what Genesis 1 says. Genesis 1 says what? It is very good. It is good. It is good. So Malebranche's theory is non-biblical right off the bat, but the result of Malebranche's theodicy, that's a solution to the problem of evil, theodicy. His theodicy was naturalism. God uses natural causes. The world arose by itself or by God's laws. Well, right there, 2 centuries before Darwin, you have a major theologian calling for evolution. He was by no means the only one. Leibniz, the great German thinker, a little bit later came along and said, there's a problem, with Malebranche's theory, and that is ambiguity. Where does God design? Where's the set point? How much evil does he allow, and how much parsimony does he want, or how much complexity does he allow? He's trying to minimize complexity, minimize evil. The choice between those is arbitrary. There's no principle. There's no sufficient reason for why you choose this point versus that point along the curve. There's a curve. You have to choose your world. Your world's going to fall somewhere on that curve of how much complexity and how much evil there's going to be. There's no sufficient reason, which is a major claim of Leibniz, that God never does anything without sufficient reason. And so Leibniz came up with his version, his theodicy, which said that God is optimizing, he's maximizing the good to evil ratio. The good to evil ratio is a polynomial, kind of a second order polynomial of some sort. Remember, Leibniz co-founded or co-discovered calculus. And what do you do in calculus? You find the optimum point. You find the maximum point of polynomials, of curves. So God was a good calculus guy. God was finding the optimum of this curve. I don't mean to make fun too much of these guys. I mean, they're trying their best. And Leibniz, I do think, was a very smart guy and had very interesting ideas. But there's also some room for levity here and kind of making fun, because this turns out to be a trend, a real strong trend in the history of thought, is people modeling God after the current state of the art. God is, God under Darwin, and God became a good, or maybe evolution became a good breeder. So it was in terms of his ideas. He presented evolution kind of in terms of breeding, and then in the 20th century, it was genetics and genetic engineering and big data and so forth. So kind of funny how that goes. But those there are a couple of examples right there. But there's a couple of examples I want to give to this question. Can he give examples? that I think are even more interesting. And that is Ralph Cudworth and John Ray. Because Ralph Cudworth and John Ray would usually be viewed as heroes of the faith. These are Christian intellectuals who are fighting Epicureanism, fighting a random chance origins. And for John Ray, for many, is the father of British natural theology. British natural theology, let's set some dates on that. Let's say 1700, 1850, roughly. 150 years. British natural theology. What's that? That's the idea of using science to make arguments for theology, for the Bible. British natural theology. The world was designed. It's a lot like intelligent design today. Although intelligent design has been crafted to be religiously neutral, it's just simply a scientific observation. It's the way they craft it. But back then it was more of let's use science because there's so many powerful evidences from science for a design. Let's do that. So that was British natural theology. John Ray, founder, in the eyes of many.
Can you explain how Epicureanism plays into this? Because I think people are confused.
Epicureanism is where you can date the problem of evil back to Epicureanism. They made the argument. Epicureanism claimed that the world arose by itself, by chance, by random motion. And why would you say that? Why they would say there was no design. There's no such thing as design. All the design that we see in the world is only apparent. It's not real. There's no such thing as real design. It's all just apparent. It arose by natural selection. They didn't use that phrase, but it was implicit in their thinking. So you can see that Epicureanism is a forerunner to evolution, and evolutionists admit this. Yeah, all those ideas are there in Epicureanism. Why did they say that? It's kind of a strange thing to say. There's no design. It's only apparent. The world arose by itself. Or the world arose by random chance. Why? What's your motivation for saying that? Well, the motivation was the problem of evil. That was a major motivation for them. It's like, the world sucks. I don't like the world. The world is all kinds of things that are bad, evil. So God wouldn't have created that. If you say that God designed our teeth for chewing because they chew so well, you also have to say that God allowed for toothaches or created toothaches. Well, I don't like that. We're not going to say that. God wouldn't do that. So if God didn't make the toothaches, then he didn't make the teeth either. So the world arose. We're having to move God away from the world. That is what the Evolution Project is all about for a dozen different reasons. That's what Epicureanism was about. So if you don't understand Epicureanism, you're not going to understand evolution, simply because that historical connection is so important. There was a revival of Epicureanism in modern times. In the 17th century, 18th century, it became popular. Those ideas became more popular. Now, I just want to talk a little bit about Cudworth and John Ray, because I talked about Malebranche. She's a Roman Catholic, so how does that play into it? It's kind of, a little bit of an outlier. Talked about Leibniz, and Leibniz definitely likes the idea of the world working by itself. If the world doesn't work by itself, then that's a bad sign, because God didn't make a very good world. So he had other arguments for why the world should have evolved. But I wouldn't call him like a strong precursor to evolution, but he was a precursor. He did have those ideas. But I want to talk about Cudworth and Ray, because normally they're not viewed as in the lineage, the intellectual lineage leading to evolution. Normally they would be considered the intellectual lineage to intelligent design. Because, as I said, Ray is considered by many the father of British natural theology. He drew a lot of his ideas from John Ray. So, I'm sorry, I mixed up the names. John Ray was the father of British natural theology. He drew a lot of his ideas from Cudworth. John Ray was a botanist and a professor, and a pretty good botanist. And Cudworth was a scholar, a literary scholar. And Cudworth argued against Epicureanism because, as I said, it was growing in popularity. He said, no, it doesn't make any sense. It's not going to rise by chance. So his arguments against Epicureanism mirror some of the arguments you see today against evolution. However, there's something strange that you might think is strange. Cudworth argued that God did not create this world. God did not create this world. Why was that? Because of the errors and the bungles, the evils. He did not create this world. Well, how did that happen? There's something between God and the world. There's some vice minister, some other mechanism. He called it a plastic nature. Pretty well undefined, but it's an inferior subordinate to God. It doesn't have the qualities of God. It's not all good, all knowing, all powerful. It's just kind of creating the world according to some instructions. It's like Batman. There's Batman, or the bad guy in the Batman movies is like, this evil genius, and then he's got this like helper who's a real idiot. So that's kind of what's going on here. You have God, but God is distanced from the world. And then there's this inferior subordinate called plastic nature. And that's doing the creating. This is from someone who is in the lineage of intelligent design and creationism. You can see that these ideas are on both sides. They're all over the place. John Ray picked up those same ideas. He also advocated for a plastic nature. Even though he's, you go into your church library, you're going to see a book on, John Ray, hero of the faith, founder of natural theology, British natural theology. But he believed that, God is not doing it. So now then you fast forward to Darwin. There was all kinds of modern science was uncovering all kinds of new evils. One was this parasitic wasp, which is it feeds on the larvae of caterpillars. It doesn't kill them. It just kind of feeds off of them as they're trying to grow. And the people who study this in the early 1800s were horrified. It's just like, oh my God, this is like, it's like torturing this poor little larva. And it's just terrible. The closer we look, the more we learn is all these evils in the world. And Darwin was right in there. Is did God create this caterpillar? Of course not. This has persisted into the 20th century, but if you're interested in, there's other ideas. It'll take me too long to go through them. But I want to now.
Are you looking at the comments? Were you looking at this one? I would be happy to shift to scientist criticism against evolution instead of sticking to philosophical topics.
Yeah, I know we do try and keep those in there, and we're kind of alternating between scientific and philosophy. But let me give you before we do that. Let me give you another one, because this is even more important. I know this might seem like old people centuries ago. It's not, because there's another argument that is exactly like the problem of evil, but it's even more powerful. So for all the power of the problem of evil and the sway that it's had over the thinking of people, this other one is even more powerful. And it's the problem of dysteleology. So if you go back to the Epicureans and you look at the arguments they made, a lot of them actually were not about evil things. They were about things that did not look like they were designed. One of their complaints was there are geographies, regions of the earth that aren't very useful. Like the desert and the different areas where I can't really use that land. Well, that's not evil, right? That is, I don't like, it doesn't, I don't imagine that God would have done that. That doesn't look designed. That's the argument of dysteleology. Dys meaning against, negative, and teleology meaning of design. There's a purpose, there's a goal. There's no purpose to this land over here.
Yeah, and I'll put up these comments to kind of bolster it, because these were coming in before we even started talking about this. So Strigata says, the thing about the laryngeal nerve in giraffes is a fantastic example of bad design in evolution and creation, of course. And then he also says the human eye is not the best design. Half the world wear glasses.
Yeah.
And again, chronic back pain is one too.
Yeah.
So this is, again, like this idea of like a creator wouldn't have created such bad designs.
Exactly. So it is exactly, first of all, I'm not sure some of those comments might have been made tongue in cheek. They might have been just, or might have been just informative, like I'm a creationist, but here's what I've heard. But I think some of them might have been actually made by evolutionists, because those are arguments that you do hear evolutionists making in the lunchroom and sometimes in the literature. So those are legitimate, real arguments that evolutionists make. And if you look back to the problem of evil, I don't like the term bad design. I think suboptimal design is more appropriate. Okay. So you're trying to soften the metaphysics, but it's still there. God wouldn't make suboptimal design. It's still a theological claim. Go back to the problem of evil and the form of that argument. It's exactly the same here. Just replace evil with something that doesn't look designed. It doesn't appear. It's not thoughtful or clever or even clean. It is a design that looks like a baling wire, and it's haphazard. It doesn't look right. It doesn't look designed. That's dysteleology. I don't like the way this was designed. It might actually work. It might have a function. It might work pretty well, but it doesn't look designed. So there is another argument, which is utility. So we're going to get to the actual, it doesn't work. And that has a different history and a whole different, and it is also a very powerful argument. But it has a different history. But the dysteleology is like, it doesn't matter whether it works or not. Even if it works pretty darn well, I don't like it. God wouldn't have done that. And so very similar. If God is all good, all powerful, all knowing, then we wouldn't have dysteleology, but we do have dysteleology. So that one is more powerful than evil in that you can find it more often in the literature. And one example is the eyeball, the mammalian vision that somebody brought up there in the comments. Yeah, the eyes of squid are better, right? So that's one example of this that is prevalent today. This isn't like, some philosopher 400 years ago. This is right now, today. Evolutionists are making this argument and believing that it is a very strong, powerful argument for evolution. It's not empirical. It's not science. We're talking about the retina. We're talking about optics. That's all science. All of that is window dressing. That is all contingent. It all utterly relies on this metaphysical claim that it would never have been designed.
And I have to say that I hear this argument all the time, this bad design argument, and it annoys me almost more than any other argument, because like the things that are in the world, that the life is so fantastic, and we can't even make a bit of it ourselves, even with all of our design capabilities. So who are we to say this is a bad design? It's very strange. So this argument already annoys me, but it's interesting to have you pointed out that this is very much a theological argument. This is not science.
Yeah. So what you're pointing out there, Rebekah, is that there are two different problems. Those two different arguments against this proof of evolution that you need to be aware of, and they're totally orthogonal. These are different problems. One is that it's not scientific. It's not empirical. There is a hidden premise snuck in, just like I talked about in the problem of evil. There's this hidden premise. You have to be aware of this. To me, that is crucial. You have to understand that. If you don't understand that, you're never going to understand evolution, because that's what evolution is all about. And when I first discovered this, I didn't believe it. I did not believe it, and I said, "No, I'm fooling myself." It's just like, there's a tendency here, but this is not at the core of evolution. It's a tendency. It's a sidebar. It's an add-on. It's an after the fact. No, it's not. It is not at all an after the fact. So you have to.
That's what I thought when I first heard this from you, because on all your videos, or on most of your videos, at the end, you'll say religion drives science and it matters. And when I first heard you saying that, I was thinking along the atheism terms, like you mentioned, of like, okay, this is materialism, it's atheism, this is, it's a philosophical commitment to naturalism, and that's what I thought you meant.
Yep.
And then when I heard you talking about, no, this is actually, theology, this is about God, it's not about atheism, I also was kind of like, is that right? I mean, and in some ways I'm still wrestling with this, because I've read now 2 of your books, and I'm like, I'm seeing it more. I'm really seeing it, and I'm starting to notice it in the arguments. But I'm still kind of at the point of, is this really core?
Yeah.
I'm kind of like, Mehrashad is like, hey, let's just make the scientific arguments against evolution. But I think this is important to explore, because if the core of evolution is actually religious, it's not scientific, then we have to know that. We have to be aware of that.
Yeah, we do. We really do. And it's not an add-on. It's not secondary. In fact, there are certain evidences and arguments where if you don't have if you don't see that hidden premise, if you haven't captured that, and that's not in your thinking and in your response, you will not understand it. You will not have an effective response. You cannot simply, point to the evidence. You have to have that. And so it to me, that's primary. So, but I said a minute ago, there's 2 different criticisms of evolutionary thought. And you were pointing out this out, that one of them is that it's religious or theological. The other is that it's making scientific claims that we don't know are true, like the eye doesn't work very well, the human eye, the mammalian eye sucks, and that there's no evidence for that. There's no scientific evidence for that. It's a metaphysical claim. But furthermore, in fact, the more we do learn, inevitably, the inevitable march of science always, this pattern plays out over and over again. It shows the function. We do find that it's not just God, having fun or playing games or just, making screwy designs. Like, oh, there's actually a reason, and it was not apparent to us. And one reason that was not apparent to us is because our first move is evolutionary. Our first move is, it's baling wire. It's haphazard. That's our first thought. This doesn't make it. This is random. So that's burned into our thinking, and we don't think, oh, gee, I don't understand what's going on there. Maybe there's something more clever that I should be thinking about. No, we have to stumble upon that years later till somebody comes up with that. And I'll explain that for the human eye as an example of it. I wanted to make that point about John Ray and Ralph Cudworth as great examples of how the problem of evil and the problem of dysteleology make their way not merely into what you might think of as hardcore evolutionists, but also what you might think of as design or creationist people who you would think of as creationists or design people. This isn't creation versus evolution, because they're really the same thing. At rock bottom, where it counts, there's no difference between evolution and creationism. They're the same thing. They come to different solutions, but the drivers are the same thing. And so it's important to understand that. And you see those similarities in the thinking. So you got the parasitic wasp that Darwin's concerned about and so forth. But I'm switching over to dysteleology now. And if you look at the Epicureans, they'd actually made arguments from dysteleology, not merely evil. If you look at evolutionists, Darwin, a lot of it was, the dysteleology, not evolution, not evil. So let's talk about the vision as an example. So you got this, light coming into our eye. It goes to the back of the eye, to the retina. Photoreceptor cells at that point convert the optics, convert the light waves to electricity. And those electrical signals are sent to the brain via the optic nerve. The optic nerve has like 1 million neurons packed into it, like a wire bundle. So you got optics, electricity. And the photoreceptor cells in our retina, there's a opsin molecule that actually is where that translation starts. The opsin configuration changes when it's impinged by light. So light hits the opsin, it's photoactive, it changes its configuration. That configuration change of that small organic molecule sets off an incredible cascade that is so unbelievably complex and bizarre that it ends up creating an electrical signal, an action potential going to the brain. That opsin is toward the rear of the way the photoreceptor cells are arranged. It's toward the rear. So the light is having to, go through the majority of the photoreceptor cell. And then the electrical signal comes out going toward the front. So the electrical signal is coming out, the wire, so to speak, the axon, the neuron coming out of the photoreceptor cell is not headed toward the brain.
So people are saying this is a bad design
backwards.
Because it's, yeah,
literally backwards. Yes, bad design, literally backwards. The neuron, the axon is coming out, going in the wrong direction. And then, so it takes a turn and they wrap together. You get a whole bunch of them coming together and they go through, there has to be a hole in your retina where they do a U-turn and go back to the brain. So the optic nerve is going back to the brain. So you have to have a hole. And that hole causes a blind spot. We aren't really conscious of it normally. There's tests you can do to kind of show it to yourself. But we have a blind spot because we have this hole where obviously there's no photoreceptor cells. And it's like, oh, this sucks. Like, this is a terrible design. It's stupid design. Not just bad. I mean, not just inefficient, not just weak. The light coming into your eye has to go through the majority of the photoreceptor cell. I mean, there's all kinds of, stuff, right? There's mitochondria and other organelles and all kinds of stuff that it has to go through. Presumably you're going to get, some attenuation to the signal, some distortion to the light wave. It's not going to help, right? And that's stupid. And then the hole in your retina.
Sorry, BS said, did this become a pro-evolution channel? Because you're just talking so much about how poorly designed this thing is that it's getting
very important to be pro-evolution. You have to understand the most powerful arguments and evidences for evolution if you're going to understand it. You can't hold back. And so now you've got the cephalopods like a squid, and it has a very similar eye. It has a very similar vision system, which is bizarre because under evolutionary theory, our common ancestor would be way back in history where there's no eye at all. And so these eyes must have evolved independently. So the cephalopod eye and the human mammalian eye evolved independently, and yet they are very similar. They're the same kind of camera eye, which is like, wow, that under evolutionary, that demolishes evolution right there. Well, I shouldn't say it demolishes, because evolutionists would just say, well, okay, so what? It evolved again. Under totally different conditions, right? These species are in the water, they're in the ocean. And it's just, how could you envision a bigger difference between two species, right? Mammals versus cephalopods, they have the same eye. It makes no sense at all under evolutionary theory. Huge failure, contradiction to the theory. But there's one huge difference between their vision systems. The cephalopods, the photoreceptor cells are not backwards. The wire, the axon coming out carrying the electrical signal, goes back toward the brain. It doesn't come out the front. And so that's evidence right off the bat that you don't have to have it coming out the front. There's like no reason for it. It's not like, well, there's got to be some reason, right? Well, they don't have it. So it's a stupid design. And so this has been a very powerful argument made by Nathan Lentz, made by Richard Dawkins. And Dawkins has a section on this in The Blind Watchmaker. There you go. It's like slammed revolution.
I just want to say too, I have heard this argument so often about this. Why isn't our eye like the octopus eye? Ours was, if a creator wouldn't have done it this way, this is a poor design. And it always bothered me so much because my eyes is one of the things I'm most thankful for. And I never thought to think this is a bad design. I mean, it's just, this is actually amazing what eyes are capable of. So it never occurred to me that this would be considered a bad design. And so I still hate that argument to begin with. But I have to give this opportunity to give a plug for your channel, because two of my favorite videos on your channel is you discussing this thing in depth about the eye, how our eye works, how the cephalopod eye works, and like the similarities, and then how actually it's a fantastic design. And so I later on, I will link those two videos in the description of this video. So if you've ever heard and been convinced that, oh yeah, the human eye is bad and the octopus eye is better, and this is evidence for evolution somehow, then please do check out those videos. So I'll do that right after the stream ends. So
Thank you, Rebekah. Yep. But as we discussed a moment ago, there are two orthogonal criticisms of evolution that are crucial. One is that it is metaphysical. Evolution is a metaphysical research program, a theological research program, and whereas it claims to be scientific. So it claims to be empirical, but where it actually is it is mandated by and incorporates theological premises. So that's a huge criticism that you have to understand. The other criticism is that it's contradicted by the science, and it's bad science. It's just the terrible science. Failed predictions all over the place. All the fundamental predictions are failed, contradicted, falsified. Doesn't have a plausible cause. There's no plausible explanation for how the tens of millions of species evolved naturally by chance. It fails all over the place. So that is true also for this argument, this retina, this human squid eye argument, this dysteleology argument. First of all, it's metaphysical. It's theological. God wouldn't create that, like the Epicureans. And so why do we need to know about the Epicureans? Because this thinking goes back to the Epicureans and before. God wouldn't do that. Why would you think God would create a backwards eyeball? It's so stupid. Of course it must have evolved. So that's not empirical. There's no scientific experiment you can perform to learn that. That comes from metaphysics, from theology. It's not scientific. Does that mean it's wrong? No, it could be right, but it's not scientific. So we need to understand that because it is claimed to be science. It's not. The other argument is that it fails on the science. So if you look, okay, well, the argument here is that it sucks. It's a bad design. Well, remember I said, well, I'll just, first I want to read a sentence or two from Richard Dawkins. So this is a contemporary, this reflects contemporary evolutionary thought. He's talking about this very problem here. This means that the light, instead of being granted an unrestricted passage to the photocells, has to pass through a forest of connecting wires, presumably suffering at least some attenuation and distortion. Now he then has a parenthetical. Parentheses, actually, probably not much. But still, it's the principle of the thing that would offend any tidy-minded engineer. That's metaphysics. Somebody read that in his proofs when he was publishing or writing the book. He must have had some reviewers, and somebody said, no, that's not that's not true. It's not a bad thing. That there's no distortion to the signal. There's no attenuation. You're making a false scientific claim. So he had to put in that parenthetical, like, actually, probably not. I don't quite understand it, but I'm being told that this is not the case. But still, I'm not going to drop this argument because this is my power argument. This is where the power of evolution lies. If you don't understand the theology and the metaphysics, you'll never understand the power. Remember when I said you have to understand the weight. You have to feel the weight. You have to feel the gravity of evolution. Otherwise, you will never understand it, and you will not be effective in explaining it to people, including evolutionists. It is a very, very powerful argument. And right there, I'm not going to drop this argument. Function doesn't matter. I don't care if it functions really, really, really well. It sucks. It doesn't. Oh, I don't like this. It offends my sensibility. It doesn't look right. There was a theologian in the 17th century. Here we are, Mueller cells in our eyes. Yep.
Exactly. Yeah, I wanted to put this up real quick because Meher Shad is actually a molecular biologist. And so he said, look, I'm putting comments about design. And so I wanted to share these. Mueller cells in our eyes and retina act like optic fibers and tune light contrast. That completely compensates for the blind spot problem, even more sufficient than was expected.
Yeah,
And
yeah. So let me just amend that slightly. I wouldn't say that it compensates for the blind spot. I would say it does things for our vision that make it way better, regardless of whether it's a blind spot or not. I don't care about that. It's just it improves our vision tremendously. And so getting back to this claim of, well, the if it's good enough for the cephalopod, it should be good enough for us just to go straight back. No, the cephalopod is missing an unbelievable level of technology. So remember I said that the light wave has to go through the photoreceptor cell, including the mitochondria, for example. Well, now we understand that the mitochondria are actually acting to focus the light. They're actually part of the optical train. That is astonishing. That is an astonishing finding that demolishes evolution. You could not have mitochondria evolved. If we're to believe evolutionary theory, then mitochondria had to evolve it somehow, which is of course never explained how that would have actually happened. But at a high level, at a cartoon level, the purpose of mitochondria, it would have evolved to produce ATP. That's the powerhouse of the cell. It takes chemical bond energy and converts it into a different form, ATP, the universal unit of energy for the body. So it's pumping out ATP. And well, what does that have to do with optics? What does that have to do with vision? How could you possibly have that level of serendipity? Oh, yeah, well, it just so happened that, mitochondria also do this unbelievably complicated optical train function to focus the incoming light. That is a level of serendipity that is stupid. Now, beyond the mitochondria, there are other layers of cells. The viewer mentioned Mueller cells. So there's several layers of cells that Richard Dawkins complained about. He said that the light on its way to the photocell has to go through all this wiring and all this other material, other layers before you get to the photocell. Well, guess what? Those layers of cells are performing optical, call it post-processing. So there's a post-processing computations going on after the action potential is generated by the photoreceptor cell. So you've got that signal coming out. It's going through a post-processing levels of post-processing. Our vision system is way beyond the cephalopods. There's no comparison. Yes, it is. There was a comparison in that the overall architecture, this camera box, sort of a design, that's very interesting, which is a major problem for evolution. But the idea that, oh, well, this is a terrible design and it stinks because it offends our understanding, our sensibilities of how the world would be created. Now, there's another couple of examples of dysteleology that I wanted to explain, because these are historical. So go back in time a little bit, because I think they're very interesting and they help to understand this. The Galileo affair. Galileo created a telescope. He was not the first one. That's a mythology. He's not the guy who invented telescopes, but he did make a better one. Early 17th century. And he was pro heliocentrism. He liked Copernicus's idea of the sun is in the middle, and he was fighting the geocentrism idea of the earth is in the middle. And so he built a telescope and started to use it. On November 30th, 1609, he looked at the moon with his new telescope. And he saw things that other people had not seen because he had a bigger, better telescope. And the main thing, looking at the moon is really cool, by the way. I mean, everybody should do it. Everybody should look through telescopes, including the planets and everything. But the moon is the biggest, most obvious, the brightest thing to look at. And it really is spectacular. And especially at the terminator, where the dark meets the light and you can see the shadows. It's really cool. And then if you look off to the side, it's just dark. It's just black. And you just get this feeling of infinity. It's like, oh my, it's just like, it just goes. And it's kind of scary, actually. But then there's one other thing about the moon. The most obvious thing when you look at the moon. What's the most obvious thing? Craters. The moon has just got tons of craters. And so Galileo, November 30th, 1609, looks at the moon and he sees all these craters. And that became one of the power arguments for heliocentrism. Remember, he was on the heliocentrism argument, trying to make that argument. And that goes down in history as not the only. There's several. There's a half a dozen or a dozen different sorts of arguments for heliocentrism. Not all of them very good, and there's some arguments against it. It didn't work that well, but this was one of them. One of the powerful arguments was craters on the moon, and that he wrote about that, and that was argued about and stuff. So yeah, okay, good. Oh, wait a minute, what? Craters on the moon? What do craters on the moon have to do with heliocentrism? There's no connection. What? Like, why would craters on the moon have anything to do with heliocentrism?
Let me guess. I'm totally guessing here. Okay. I've never heard about this. So, but just kind of the line of argumentation could be something like, well, these are like imperfections on the moon. And so like, we're thinking of geocentrism as like this perfect way of God setting up things. And maybe, like the craters on the moon is imperfect. And then, in the same way, we can see that God may have done heliocentrism, and that's not perfect either. But I don't know. Is this at all like, am I getting warm?
You're definitely getting warm. You're in the right ballpark. You're missing a couple of little details, but that is exactly the direction to go. So the way I explain this is, what was the opposing view, the opposing geocentrism view? Where did that come from? What was the group? What was the thought? What was the camp that was advocating for that and that he was fighting? Well, it was the Bible and the Roman Catholic Church, right? No, it was not. That's a mythology. That was not a problem. Yes, no, I'm not going to go there. This was not a church versus Galileo thing. The group that he was fighting was Aristotelianism. And Aristotelianism was a teleological philosophy, physics. It said that objects in the world is made up of objects that have properties and goals. What is the goal of a rock? I don't have a rock here, but pretend, I do have a rock here, right here. So what is the goal of this rock? Well, it's to get to It's not merely to go down. It's to get. How do I know it's not merely to go down? When I drop it, it hits the earth and it stops. But what if I dig a hole and I do it again? It'll go to the bottom of the hole. What if I dig the hole deeper? It'll go to the bottom of that hole. Its goal is to get to the center of the earth. That's the goal of earthly matter, is to get to the center of the earth. And so that's an example of, like, everything has a goal. It's just teleological. Teeth are for chewing under Aristotelianism. So it was a very teleological philosophy. And they realized that things out there above the earth, when you get out to the moon, it's different, because natural motion down here is up and down. Yes, things go sideways sometimes, but that's because of the wind, or if you throw something, that's unnatural. Natural motion is up and down. But what about up there? Is it up and down? No, it's lateral. Everything goes sideways. So up there, natural motion is sideways. So you have a different realm. There's the sublunar realm and the superlunar realm. The superlunar realm is up there, and it's also perfect up there. It's ephemeral. It's all those things. And it has its own set of, natural laws are different up there. That's why Newton's gravity is called universal. Why do you say it's universal? How do we know what's going on, gazillions of miles away at some distant galaxy? It's because there's no longer Aristotelianism. We got rid of the sublunar, superlunar. Okay, that's an aside. So Aristotelianism was advocating geocentrism. The Earth, remember, things want to go down. The Earth is at the center. The center of the Earth is at the center of the universe. And not because of some religion or ego or anything. In fact, it was considered kind of a garbage dump. It's because that's natural motion that we observe. And so it's the center. And up there is perfect. And so Galileo observes this and it's like, oh, this just demolished Aristotelianism. It's not perfect. It's like gross. It's random. It's chaotic. This is not clever at all. We expected some smooth surface, maybe with some discolorations that we see, but this is not it. That's not that. Like, this is not Aristotelianism. That's gone. That's out the window. And so it was all from a dysteleology perspective that was arguing for heliocentrism in this weird historical way. And so sometimes these arguments are not bad. Like, we come up with these arguments of these religious, theological, or metaphysical arguments for things that, might actually lead to truth. So it doesn't mean that it's necessarily false, but it's not science. And so that's an example of, kind of an interesting historical example. Later in the century, there was another guy who actually was, I would say, more influential than Galileo, but you've never heard of him. And he didn't like craters also. His name was Burnet, Thomas Burnet. He was a cleric, an Anglican cleric, late 17th century. And he was in contact with Newton, and he kind of knew about what science was doing. And he had an incredibly strong sense of design aesthetic. He was real sensitive to beauty and aesthetics. And like, he went to the Alps for a vacation, and when you see the Alps from a distance, they're beautiful. But then when you go up into the mountains, it's ugly. It's like the rock moraines and stuff. Like, I've had that personal experience. I think a lot of people probably had that. Like, this is not beautiful. I don't like this. The jagged coastlines. They were making better and better maps in those days. And you had these incredibly jagged, look like in Norway, the fjords and all that stuff. It's like, what? This is ugly. This is like totally ugly. Why would God create something like this? And he said, if you went out and if you went out outer space and looked at Earth, it would probably look a lot like the moon. Like, and the moon is terrible. God is not going to do that. And he's not going to make the Earth. So he made these very powerful arguments, and he had this very influential book that he wrote about the origin of the world. and was full of these dysteleology arguments. He influenced Kant and Leibniz, and he really, even though he had a lot of critics, but he also was very influential. So those are some examples of interesting examples of dysteleology. You have in Burnett and Nicholas Malebranche, you have theologians 2 centuries before Darwin insisting on naturalistic origins. God wouldn't have done this. It's not that there's no God. It's not even that God is not involved at all. There's a little bit of involvement. He's choosing the set point. He's doing some stuff, but he doesn't get into the details. Then you see that with Ralph Cudworth and John Ray and so forth. And then you see today, these same old arguments being set forth as these very powerful arguments for why evolution must be true. These are not the only arguments for evolution by any means. There's many others, and some of the others are more scientific sounding than this, like the principle of plenitude, which we have mentioned a few times. We'll talk about that in more detail in the future at some future podcasts. But some of them are very scientific sounding, but they're not. And that's why this is so important to understand the underlying history of thought, the philosophy, the history, and the theology at work in evolutionary thought.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And do you want me to put up a couple of comments?
Sure, yeah.
Mehrashad says, teleology conveys purpose, and purpose requires foresight, and that needs intelligence.
Yeah. Teleology is the idea that there is an idea, a purpose, a goal, an objective. Something is going on. Why did the ball fly through the air? Well, it was because my hand threw it. Well, why did your hand throw it? Because my wrist pushed on the hand. Well, why did the wrist? Because my forearm. Well, why the forearm? Because my elbow. Why? Because the upper arm. Because the shoulder. So why? You have to stop that at some point and say, why did that happen? Because I had the idea. That's the final cause. That's what the word final cause refers to, and that Aristotelianism described the world in terms of final causes. Final cause doesn't mean the last cause; it means the first cause, right? That's what's underlying. It's the end of the why questions. And so, a teleological view of the world is that there are final causes, which are non-material. And so that's where you get your British natural theology, you get your intelligent design, is that teleology is a valid category. Whereas in the evolutionary thought, it's not valid. That is all an apparent. It's only apparent. It's a deception. There's no such thing as real teleology. And the reason why there cannot be real teleology is because of the evil and the dysteleology and the dysutility of the world. The world does not look like a thoughtful God, an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-good God would have done that. And so it must not be true. There must not be any real teleology. It is a mythology. Teleology cannot be real. That's a religious argument.
And by the way, to Mehrashad and Wes also, and the others in the comments, I really appreciate those who make the comments in support of intelligent design creation and against and kind of combat evolution in my comment section and in the chats, because I don't have time to respond to every comment. So I love it when I see that people have gone in and responded to others. So thank you so much. Wesley, this was from the beginning. He said phylogenetics is ad hoc. It is not evidence for the model. It is what needs to be shown with evidence. It is not evidence in and of itself.
Yeah, and I think that's especially true. You could make the argument that it kind of sounds like you're making a philosophical argument, like it cannot be. There's another argument which is more practical, which is that it isn't because it fails, because the patterns do not support common descent. It's so overwhelmingly, the contradictions to common descent are so overwhelming and so pervasive that even if you allow for the fact that, yeah, conceptually, in principle, this could be a proof or a strong argument, a confirmation of evolution, it isn't. And so I think that's a powerful way to look at it. It's just the evolutionists have to come up with so much ad hoc explanations.
Yeah. Frank says, great presentation, especially references to Isaiah 45:7, the hidden premise that an all-good, all-powerful, and all-knowing God would not allow natural evil, and the Aristotelian source of geocentrism.
Thank you, Frank. Appreciate that. Yeah, it is very interesting, isn't it? I mean, I know that my students in my 3-credit undergrad class love it. You know, it's just, this is really interesting material. The good students, there are some students who don't like it, but in my view, the good students love it. And they always said, yeah, this is my best class. You know, I really enjoyed this. It's just so interesting to go through this history of thought where you're really explaining things. And I ran into one student years later, and it was like a year later, like after the class, and he said, I think about it every day. So
wow.
That's cool. Yeah.
Cool. Dr. Thompson says, does Dr. Hunter think humans and chimps shared a common ancestor? If not, what is his explanation for the origin of chimps, humans, and chimps?
Yeah, good question, Chris. So no, I do not think they share a common ancestor, because evolutionary theory has failed so badly that it's just I'm kind of driven by the science. To me, I go by the science mainly, and it just, evolution has failed so badly. I could never, with the current state of the science, I could never support that kind of a theory. I'm just not going to go where the evolutionists go, with all the fake, phony claims. I call them fake and phony from a scientific perspective. I realize I like to point out they are totally valid logically, and they have very powerful arguments. And from a religious perspective, they're totally good arguments. They're great religious arguments. And these are very, very good religious arguments. They're non-biblical and they are non-scientific, but otherwise they're great. So no, I would never say chimps and humans share a common ancestor. That's ridiculous. What was my explanation for them? Sorry, I wasn't there. I wasn't there. So, to ask these ultimate questions, evolutionists and creationists are very comfortable making claims that they can't support and they don't have sufficient evidence for. It's as though we're supposed to understand everything. Like, what do you think? Well, sorry, I'm not. I got a hotline to God. Okay, so I don't have the details.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, thank you for everything that you shared today. It was really awesome presentation, and thank you for those who supported us today. Any final thoughts?
No, I think that's it. Thank you again, Rebekah. I really appreciate the time and your channel.
I appreciate you too, Dr. Hunter. And Dr. Hunter's channel is called Darwin's God, and there is great content on that channel. So please do check it out. And I'll put the links to those videos about the eye, the human eye and the octopus eye. And so thank you for watching. Thank you for all who support. Thank you for, I didn't mention Matt from Pigs Can Fly on there, but thank you. And even for those who are, believe in evolution, but are willing to have these conversations, appreciate you too. Thank you. And have a good day, everybody.
Yeah.